Okay, is that on? Crank that up a bit. All right. Ooh, loud. Perfect. I will turn that down just a little bit. All right, let's get going for today. So, all right, perfect. So we're gonna keep going today. We were looking last time at concepts and theories, specifically concepts and theories related to different ways that economic systems or economic theories look at the labor, at the value of labor, right? So we looked at, we've looked here at sort of the liberal view, right, or the classical view of Adam Smith, the Marxist view, and then we jumped into, a pretty long discussion last time of the Austrian view and the way that the Austrian view changes that kind of equation from this very, objective, okay, the value of labor is, a good is worth, or the excess value of the good once you take out the cost of the raw materials is the value of the labor, right? And we went to more of this idea of a marginal theory where it's like, okay, because the value of a good is never known, right? You never actually know what a good is worth until you sell it in the market because you don't know what people will actually pay for it. Labor then doesn't have an objective value. Its value is established in what workers are able to get for it, what employers think it's worth, and therefore, and we added a few nuances, kind of trying to refute that Marxist labor theory of value that profit is theft of the added value the workers put in, because owners will put in investment, they take the risk, and investors are foregoing other things they could do with their money while they wait for that investment to return value. All right, so we ended off last time talking a little bit about Durkheim, right? And his kind of view that work is part of this thing of social cohesion, and especially with the break that industrialization creates, that it was going to take a while for the world to kind of readjust for workers and owners to come up with a system that basically allowed them to cooperate and these sorts of things. Okay, where did I end off? I think I ended off with this slide, right? I think I ended off with this slide. I can't quite remember, and sometimes I check the video. I didn't do it this time. Okay, so we're talking about social cohesion. So I guess we ended off around here. So as societies become more complex, the division of labor undermines collective consciousness. So as you get more segmented, people get more specialized tasks, people share less common tasks. Durkheim thinks that this collective values, kind of collective norms, breaks down a little bit. Okay, and I mentioned this last time, right? In simple societies, people had direct ties to people through relationships of exchange and tradition, right? So basically, even if you were doing a specialized task, like you were the village baker, you still had to get your grain from the farmers, right? You still had to, shoe your horse at the blacksmiths. There were these pretty intimate relationships. But industrialization, right, in more complex societies, those relationships break down, right? And you increasingly have more indirect forms of relationship. And if you want to think about this in really kind of modern terms, think of like the farmer, right? And you. The farmer and you. So between the farmer and you in the past, right, it would have been a much more direct relationship, right? Maybe, let's just say for bread, there was the farmer, there was the baker or the miller, the person who ground grain into wheat. There was the baker who took the flour, and then there was you, right? Now, increasingly, right, in modern societies, the farmer, right, goes to probably the wheat board. The wheat board goes to, a factory where they make flour. The factory sends that flour to, a bread factory. Maybe McGavin's or Wonder Bread or whatever it happens to be. That bread factory sends it to the grocery store, which sells it to you, right? Now, this is probably not even all of the steps in the process, right? But you can see that, in a modern society, there's a few intermediate steps that come between you and the farmer, right? More steps from here to here. So those relationships get more and more indirect. And this is true of almost everything that we have produced, right? Whereas, here in medieval society, you probably knew the farmer. Now, the chances that you know the farmer that grew your wheat are essentially infinitesimal, right? The chances are most of you don't know that many farmers. And the farmers you do know maybe grow canola, right? So there's, not that matters. But, there's a much more indirect relationship now than there was in the past. So in complex societies, you have more indirect forms of relationship, but increased interdependence. Your ability to kind of mitigate things and feed yourself is substantially reduced from the past, right? So, I'll put it to you, I guess, in this way. So my mom grew up on a farm in northern Alberta, and they had a big, they had a farm, and they had cows, they had chickens, they had pigs, they had a massive vegetable garden and a small orchard with some raspberry and apple trees, raspberry bushes and apple trees on the farm. And basically, my grandmother, during the Depression, right? One of the things that my grandmother always said was that, they were poor, but they didn't have the problem of feeding themselves, right? Because they had most of the resources available to them. They had eggs, they had meat from the pigs, cows, and chickens, right? They had, everything they grew in the vegetable garden, they canned and it fed them through the winter. And just to put it in context, my mom is one of a family of 14, of which 9 were at home at any given point, right? So, and plus the 2 parents. So lots of mouths to feed, but they were always able to feed themselves, right? And yeah, they had to buy flour, but they could trade things like eggs for flour, even if they had no money. Now, think about you. If all of a sudden you had to feed the food system breaks down, what happens? You probably starve to death, right? Because you're one of the people that, gets a hockey stick out of the garage and you go try to raid the Costco warehouse for whatever you can carry away, right? You employ violence and looting to feed yourself, right? But your ability to feed yourself is much less. You are incredibly dependent on this massive food system that we've created just to feed yourself, right? And clothe yourself, right? Would any of you be able to go down to Fabricland, grab a bunch of fabric and sew yourself a pair of pants? I venture probably not, right? So, and again, this is something that my grandmother could do. This is something my mother-in-law can do. This is not something I can do. So we're very much more interdependent, right? We're dependent on each other in very considerable ways. And you're incredibly dependent on that farmer, even though, you're at a much greater remove from that farmer socially. Okay, so despite our more indirect relationships, we're actually more dependent on other people to stay alive. Okay, simple societies, laws tend to be very punitive, right? So this is a point that Durkheim makes. It's also a point that Foucault will make when we come into the 1960s. He was a very famous French social thinker. In kind of medieval society, the laws would have been very punitive, and their execution would have been very, very public, right? So if you've ever seen, I don't know, like an old Robin Hood movie, and you've got the person who owes debts, and he's in the stocks, right, in the wooden thing where his head and arms are sticking out, and people throw vegetables at them, right? These are the kinds of laws that you would have found in the medieval period. Executions were pretty common. Laws were very punitive, basically because social cohesion mattered, right? If social cohesion starts to break down, survival is threatened. Okay, complex societies, though, are a little bit different. Their laws tend to be more focused on the restorative, right? The hope that you could bring a person back into right relationship with society through a form of rehabilitation, right? And at least, even though our criminal justice system is far from perfect, that remains kind of one of its goals is rehabilitation, right? Trying to help people reintegrate into society. Well, I'll say it doesn't often work, but it's still there. Okay. I just like this comment, so I'm never going to get rid of it. It's just going to stay there forever. All right, I'm kidding. Okay, so I talked about anomie last time, right? This is this concept from Durkheim of what kind of happens to people as their relationships, to other parts of society becomes less direct, more and more indirect, and they stop seeing how they fit in, right? So he ties this to the increased division of labor, right? When you are doing one tiny little task, within society, I don't know, maybe you work at a bank and you're underwriting, only a specific kind of loan that goes to, I don't know, whatever, homeowners who want to build, solar panels onto their house. And that's your whole job, right? Is checking those loans. Or, you're an engineer and you are in charge of, wells in northern Alberta in this tiny quadrant of land that the company you work for owns. You can start to feel disconnected from the whole of society, right? So it's a disjunct between, the individual or group standards and wider social standards because you feel disconnected from society. And basically, in this condition, people feel like they have little moral guidance from society, right? They don't feel connected to it. A lot of the rules, they don't know why they're there or they don't obey them. So they start to feel disconnected. No investment or control in their own lives, right? If you are doing one tiny task, you might feel like your life is not your own. Like you're just a cog in a machine, right? And this is a very kind of common theme in Marx and Weber and Durkheim, that people in kind of industrial society start to feel like just a gear, right? Just a piece of the machinery, easily replaceable. I mean, think about McDonald's, right? McDonald's is a great example of this because McDonald's is super rationalized in the way it works. If you were working at McDonald's and you are the fry cook at McDonald's, and you quit, or you get hit by a bus, or you just stop coming into work, what is McDonald's going to do? Well, they're just going to find someone else to do that job, right? And so you're not essential in any way. None of your contribution really matters. Although the fries at McDonald's are really excellent, especially when they're piping hot, but anyone can cook them, right? So you stop feeling like you have an investment or a control of your life or really a place in society. Now for Durkheim, this disconnection, at its extreme, he thinks leads to suicide. And he thinks suicide comes from the breakdown of social bonds, right? So he does think that the coming industrial order leads to an increase in breakdown of social bonds and potentially, people taking their own lives. Okay, and frequently when one way of doing things is replaced by another, people feel this loss of control. And again, he thinks this is what's happening with the coming of industrialization. Okay, so go back a half sec. Oh yeah, no questions, perfect. Our next big thinker in sociology is this cat. This is Max Weber, a German, kind of in the same vein as Marx. So usually when we talk about Weber in sociology, we put him into what's called, conflict theory or conflict view. And that's the same kind of category that we put Marx in. But Weber is coming on a little bit later. And Weber is though he views Marx's work as very useful, he also thinks that Marx gets a few things wrong. And specifically, one of the things that Weber looks at is he thinks that Marx's view is too narrow, right? That this whole idea of like conflict between just two social classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, is incorrect. And he's looking at how industrial society has sort of started to reorganize itself and create all sorts of conflicts all over the place, right? But specifically when we talk about work, and we could go into Weber's work and we can talk about religion and politics, but we'll narrow it down and try to talk just about work. One of the things that he views as really problematic, especially for workers, is rationalization and bureaucracy. And these are kind of his key concerns. Now, he thinks that, so what he means by rationalization is he thinks that one of the features of industrial societies, right, as these societies get more complex, is they get more focused on science. And one of the things that comes with getting more focused on science is you try to figure out, and this is what he calls rationalization, the most efficient way of doing everything, right? And when I say, everything, I mean everything. Rationalization becomes a major concern, and we'll see this as we move through the course, right? Because at one point we're going to get to a movement, sometimes referred to as Taylorism, but more commonly referred to as scientific management. And the goal of scientific management is just this. It is rationalizing every process in the workplace. So when I say rationalizing, I mean using our reason to find the best way to do them, right? The best and fastest. And like I've said a few times, and again, we'll look at it a little bit later, this comes down to people looking at your house and being like, okay, if you're and I mean, because it's done mostly in the 1950s, right? This is the sort of language that people are thinking through. We want to make the housewife, right? Her tasks are things like cooking and cleaning in the kitchen. And so we want to organize that kitchen in the most efficient way possible to minimize movement, right? So that, when she's thinking, okay, I'm cooking something now, and I'm going to turn around and take one step, and then I can wash that pot, right? Or if I'm looking for my, my implements, right, or my pots, my stove is here, my pots are here, so that everything moves in a super fast, efficient way to reduce unnecessary movement and time wastage, right? So they're like, yes, everything, even in your house, has to be as efficient as possible. Okay, and like I said, when it comes to work, this becomes a quasi-obsession through the beginning and even into like really up until the present. People are obsessed with this idea of efficiency, how to reduce the number of steps, reduce any time wastage in the workplace to make it as efficient as possible. Okay, so one of the ways that this is done, right, this is our division of labor. Wide-ranging jobs are replaced by narrow sets of tasks. So each person gets really, really good at a very narrow set of tasks. Informal work relationships are replaced by formal and impersonal ones, right? And this is the rise of the manager the dreaded evil creature that stalks the workplace looking for victims. Maybe that's just my experience. I worked at a rental car company for a while, and nothing was worse than when upper management came to visit, because suddenly you had to go from completely ignoring as many work policies as possible to pretending that you follow them all the time. And good grief, there were a lot of them. Okay, and education and qualifications became central to success, right? So as workplaces get more sophisticated, they demand more things, the level of education that people need to do jobs grows and grows. And managers especially, are typically pretty highly educated. Okay, so one other kind of concept from Weber that matters. The iron cage of bureaucracy, he thinks, really starts to dominate workplaces and dominate work. So what does this mean? Well, what he is basically suggesting is that bureaucracy becomes, bureaucracy, if you want to, the origins of the word, bureau or desk, and the rule of, right? So it is the rule of the desk. It is, so when you think of a bureaucrat, you can think of like the king of whatever little part of an organization they happen to be running, ruling that little, we could call it a fiefdom or a little kingdom of their own, right? So if you ever had to, do something in the university, right? You need to, apply for your co-ops or something. There is inevitably one official, right? One person within your department that controls this process. And you have to do, you have to fill out the forms a particular way. You have to submit them by a particular date. There's a ton of steps. This is what Weber means by the iron cage of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy and its highly rationalized way of doing things with officials that are super specialized in one set of tasks, they start to rule over everything, right? And greater parts of the society. The bureaucracy grows and grows. Okay, so for Weber, right? He actually thinks that bureaucracy is kind of a good thing. I can only assume he's never encountered one, or certainly not enough of them. So he thinks it's the most efficient form of governance for society and large complex organizations, is to have these super specialized people that rule over one particular kind of process. Okay, so bureaucracy for him has a few defining characteristics. Sorry for crossing that out. Okay, so it's a very rigid division of labor, right? Which clearly identifies regular tasks and duties of the particular bureaucratic system. So every bureaucrat has a set of tasks that they are supposed to do, right? And if you, there's always those sketches of like people going to the DMV in the US, right? And it's like, or, to file a form in the US with like the city. And it's like, oh, actually you're in the wrong line, right? You actually have to you take this form and go into that other line to get it stamped, and then you go back into this line. That's kind of a joke on bureaucracy. The reason is every person in the bureaucracy is supposed to have a super rigid, super limited set of tasks that they specialize in, right? And that's what they do. Okay. Bureaucracies also have a firmly established chain of command and duties and capacities, to coerce others to comply is described by regulations, right? So a lot of rules and a lot of regulations. Okay, so here's an example. You have a problem with your phone bill, right? And you phone TELUS or Bell or Rogers, and you're like, okay, there's a problem with my phone bill, or, my bill is too high. I'd really like to get, actually, you know what? Let me give you a real world example. I did this a few years ago with TELUS because I had been on like a 2-year contract, and then my internet rates doubled, right? Because it's like, your contract's up, you're no longer on the promotional rate. Super, love it. So I had to phone TELUS. And I phoned TELUS and I was like, hey, obviously my bill is really high. It's doubled in cost in the last couple of months. I would like to get on your your lowest rate at back on a promotional rate for whatever you're offering. So if you could do that, and it was like, I talked to this person. Honestly, this process took me about 2 hours. So I talked to this person at TELUS, which I assume was, some poor call center employee. And I was like, okay, this is what I need. This is what I'm looking for. This is my thing. Your competitor's rate is this, right? This is what Rogers is offering for cable internet. Your competitor's rate is this. I need you to get me that rate. The only reason I bothered with TELUS and didn't switch over to Rogers is because my wife has a TELUS.net email address that she doesn't want to give up. And so we're forever trapped with TELUS until we die. There is no way out of this, apparently, except to pay $10 a month so my wife can continue using that email address, which I love, by the way. Anyway, so I'm like, this is the rate, this is the rate. And we went back and forth, and they're like, oh, I can give you that rate if you get TELUS Home Security. And I'm like, I don't want TELUS Home Security. And finally, it was like, okay, now we have to escalate. You're going to talk to my manager. So I talked to their manager for about 45 minutes about the same things. And then it escalated up to their customer retention department, right? So there was this very clear, step up. I had to start with the basic customer service rep and move my way up until I hit the person that actually had power. And this to say yes to my thing, right? Because that customer service agent didn't actually have the power to say yes to anything. And by the way, much of the time here was holding, where they would put me on hold, hoping that I would quit. But I had scheduled half my day to do this task. Because I knew how long this was going to take. You can save a lot of money doing this, by the way, if you have the patience to do so. Finally, you had to go up the ladder, up the bureaucracy from the low level, and I can only assume this was mid-level kind of customer retention person that was allowed, right? And there were a lot of rules and regulations and scripts they had to follow. And because I was an existing customer, not a new customer, they couldn't give me the new, blah, 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 right? There's a million excuses and a million regulations they had to follow. Okay, that's kind of what it looks like. And yeah, managers, right? If you can ever get this escalated to a manager, managers have the right to get employees to comply. When I worked in car rental for about 3 years after I got my undergrad degree, which is not a good job. Do not work in car rental. It's bad. One of the things that would frequently happen is, people would buy the insurance, right? The extra insurance you can get on a rental car. It's a complete scam, never get it. But our job was to talk people into getting it. And then they would, return the car and realize that this extra insurance was going to cost them like $700 or something. And they didn't want to pay it. So they would escalate things up, and I'd be like, no, you signed for it. You have to pay for it. And then it would go up to my manager, and my manager would call me and be like, you have to let this person off the hook. I was like, but I don't want to. And they're like, tough, just do it, right? Because they had the power to coerce me to break the rules. And I was the worst at selling this kind of insurance because I really didn't believe in it. So when someone signed up for it and I was selling it, I was really like, no, come on. Like, I didn't hard sell you on this at all. You signed up for it. Just pay for it. And I can honestly, it must have been like 20 times I had it overturned, which messed with my commission. And that's what really made me mad. Anyway, neither here nor there. I'm not bitter about my time at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, except that I'm extremely bitter about my time at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. All right, so you'll hear about it more later in the course. So, regular and continuous execution of assigned duties undertaken by hiring people with particular qualifications, right? So whatever the bureaucracy does, it does it over and over and over again, and you hire people with particular skills, right? One of the big bureaucracies that you'll probably run into in life is HR, human resources, right, that have these tasks of hiring. A lot of discipline goes through HR now, and all of this kind of stuff. So these tasks are done over and over again. Okay, our main principles of bureaucracy, according to Weber. I've been talking about this. Specialized role. Each bureaucrat does something particular. They're in charge of a particular thing, not the whole organization. Recruitment is supposed to be based on merit and tested through open competition. Now, this is something that I think was probably more true when Weber was writing than it is today, right? Not to say that people who work in like government aren't, their recruitment isn't based on merit, But back when Weber was writing, you had these really, really difficult civil service exams. So famously, right, the British civil service exam involved significant portions that were based in reading and writing Latin and Greek. Why? Not because you were ever going to need Latin and Greek working in the British civil service, but because that was the mark of an educated person, that they could read and write and understand both Latin and Greek, and it was a sort of an IQ test, right? If you could pass, and it was a test, you would sign up to do the British civil service exam, and you would go to a building and write a test in a book, and you had to do math, you had to do Greek and Latin and a whole bunch of other things. And it's a sort of an IQ test, right? Are you smart enough to work in Her Majesty's or His Majesty's bureaucracy, depending on when you're talking? So recruitment based on merit, was based on things like civil service exams. That is no longer the case today, but definitely was when Weber was writing. Okay, typically uniform principles of placement, promotion, and transfer in an administrative system. So this is very much how things work at the university today, right? There's rules for how you get, placed, where you can get placed. If you want to get transferred to a different unit, there's process and promotion, right? To get promoted to different ranks, there are things you have to do, right? There are, basically tasks you have to complete. So for example, for a professor, for research professors, it's about, how many articles you're publishing, and to an extent your student reviews, right? So your spots, I guess. Used to be USRIs, now it's spot. I'm a teaching professor, so mine is entirely based on the number of courses that I teach. So as I teach more courses, and as long as my student evaluations are good, I move up the ladder. And usually when I go to the next rank, my supervisor will come in, they'll watch me teach, and they'll do a little evaluation, and then they file for my promotion. But they're very strict rules. Okay, careerism. Bureaucracies, at least in principle, are supposed to be places where people build a career, and they move. They learn the bureaucracy as they move up through it, and typically with a systemic salary structure. So you start at a low salary and move your way up. Hierarchy. So someone's in charge. There are ranks. Weirdly, if you look at the old Russian czarist civil service, there were actually ranks, right? So as you move through, it was almost like the civil service in Russia was almost like an army. You started at, I can't remember the bottom rank of it, but you would move up to, the top rank was Statsky Sovietnik, state counselor. Sorry, I was forgetting it. I can't remember what the bottom rank is, but you would move up these different ranks of the civil service, and there were medals and there were uniforms. There was all this stuff, right? That's a very extreme example, but there's always hierarchies, right? There's customer service representative, assistant manager, regional manager, group there's all these ranks of within any kind of bureaucratic system. Okay. Your official conduct is supposed to be subject to strict rules of discipline and control, right? Because and this is where HR steps in, right? You're supposed to follow certain rules, right? You are not supposed to sexually harass, your underlings. You're supposed to speak in a certain way, right? You can't berate people. You can't swear at them. There are rules of conduct of how you behave in the workplace. And like I said, increasingly governed by Human Resources Department. And there's the supremacy of abstract rules, right? The bureaucracy is a rule-based order, and you have to follow those rules to succeed in it. Now, obviously, people bend those rules, but the idea of a bureaucracy is these rules are supposed to be, in place forever. And they're supposed to be the things that work all the time. Okay. Impersonal authority. Right, so generally the office bearer does not bring the office with them. So this specifically would separate it for Weber. Again, think of the time he's writing as I can't remember how to spell hereditary. I can't remember if the E or the I goes first, but I'll say hereditary, right? So like, my father was the, fourth Earl of Brunswick. And so I become the fifth Earl of Brunswick when he dies, right? The title passes in family. Not how bureaucracy works, right? The office bearer does not bring the office with them. So think about this, right? If we must. This is what's happening today in Washington, D.C., right? President Biden is basically being replaced by President Trump, right? And President Biden, though he gets to keep the title of president, he doesn't get to take the office with him, right? The new person gets the official title of president and the control of the office. And when Trump eventually leaves office, fingers crossed, he'll pass it to the next person who is elected president, right? And so, right, like if the manager leaves their job, right, they don't get to take the office of manager with them. It passes on to the next person, right? So the authority isn't tied to that specific person. Same thing with the military, right? The rank, like the general in charge of a unit or the person in charge of an army, right? Basically, that will pass to the next person who holds that office. Okay, and political neutrality, especially in government, is the idea that it should serve whatever government is in power, right, in a neutral kind of way. So like if a conservative government replaces the liberal government in Canada, that bureaucracy should serve that government in a politically neutral way as much as possible. Okay, I'm thinking this is not as interesting as the last lecture. Okay, so changes in the 20th and 21st century. One of the things that happens as we move through, I love those tables, as we move through the 20th century, you go from, in a sense, the bourgeoisie, right? This thing that Marx was complaining about, the bourgeoisie, which typically had a single owner. And you can think of think of Ford, right, as owned by Henry Ford. As you move forward historically, Ford is no longer really owned by the Ford family, right? It becomes this massive corporation that's owned by the shareholders, right? So we shift from, owner capitalism to shareholder capitalism, right? So, and the corporations get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And they get less personal. So the world economy, as we move forward, and very much so today, is increasingly dominated by transnational and multinational corporations, right? Companies that span a few different countries or are global. Think Google, Apple, Microsoft, Coca-Cola, Nike, right? And you could list companies, until you're blue in the face, because a lot of the companies that we, use their products and interact with every day are these massive transnational corporations, and you can't get away from them anymore. Okay. Yeah, so typically these will have, either wealthy people or more typically wealth funds as some kind of owner, right? Big funds like BlackRock that control a lot of, big percentages of large corporations. Really wealthy people, right? Maybe your Bill Gates or your Warren Buffetts, right, control large chunks of really important corporations. And yeah, often several activist minority owners. Increasingly lots of corporations. So this was happening at Disney a couple of years ago. Disney, which has been kind of spiraling downwards in terms of stock value and profitability on the back of, bad Star Wars, Marvel movies and an endless stream of remakes of childhood classics that were perfect to begin with and didn't need remakes. What ended up happening was some activist shareholders jumped in and purchased big chunks of the stock, trying then to basically force current management out and basically change the direction of the company. And you see this fairly frequently, right? It happened to Microsoft back in the 2010s, right? They were not doing great. And minority shareholders kind of tried to get proxy of a majority of the shareholders. So basically say, vote with us to try and restructure the company. It just happened at Disney, and in both cases it failed, but it happens with fair frequency. And sometimes these minority owners can drastically change the direction of a company. Okay. So the responsibility of management of these companies is to shareholders and specifically to profits. So this is often referred to as fiduciary responsibility, but your main, in shareholder capitalism, and again, this is actually strongly influenced by Milton Friedman and sort of the neoliberal kind of economic turn, is that corporations, what is their principal responsibility? It's not social, right? It's not to the society they're in, it's to their shareholders and specifically to profits. This has led to a lot of complaints about shareholder capitalism, specifically that engages often in short-term thinking, right? Something that's going to juice the profits in the short term might not necessarily be good either socially, for the whole society or for the company in the long term. But because everything is essentially returning value to shareholders, and often this is done through dividends, ultimately, companies basically do short-term things to pay out dividends to their shareholders, regardless of if that is going to be good for the company long-term. Okay. Sorry, I'm just looking for my question slide. Okay, no questions still. All right, 8 minutes. So, yeah, fewer of these businesses are owned primarily by individuals or families, right? Even if, sometimes some of the original owners maintain large shares of these companies, they're almost always now minority shares. And you can think of, Ford again as one of these, Walmart, right? The Walton family that founded Walmart owns a lot of shares, but it's now a minority of the shares. They actually have a minority stake in the company. They're still fabulously wealthy because Walmart, who could live without Walmart, but they no longer control the overall company, right? And it's not, a Walton in charge or making all the policy. It's the board. Increasingly, the decline of these single-family owners has led to the rise of a managerial class, especially what you would call C-suite executives, right? And here you're thinking your CEO is the big one, but your COO and CFO, right, the chief financial officer, are all important managers that run these companies in major ways. And often, these are basically employees, right? These are employees of the company rather than owners. Now, you do get these people often compensated with shares in the company, but very seldom do they own the company outright. And you can think of here Satya Nadella at Microsoft, right? He's been a long-time employee of Microsoft. He owns shares in the company, but far from a majority stake, but he controls it. Tim Cook at Apple, same thing, right? He is an employee of the company. He serves as the CEO of the company, but he owns shares, but he doesn't own a majority of it, not even close. And even, like Elon Musk, he owns a big chunk of Tesla, but I don't even know if he owns the majority of it at this point. But someone could fact check me on that. Okay. Initially, as this was happening, and this was shifting from family ownership to these employed owners or these employed managers of the company, right, CEOs, there was some speculation that these salaried workers, so the CEOs would act as a bridge between the elite owners and ordinary workers and bring equality to the workplace, right? Because Satya Nadella is just as much an employee of Microsoft as, the base level programmer that got hired 5 minutes ago. They can both be terminated at any point. But this really hasn't been the case, right? Typically, management aligns with ownership and particularly with the board and elite institutions, not with everyday workers, right? So even though Ford is, controlled by a CEO and he's an employee, he doesn't really identify with those factory workers. He's not like, these are my brothers in organized labor. He's more like, they're a problem that has to be managed for the good of the shareholders and the ownership class. So what we've actually seen is a growth in inequality between management and workers, and especially in terms of pay. The pay for, CEOs in some cases is as high as like 200 to 300 times what the average worker in a company gets. And this has led to all sorts of really bizarre problems. Like if you think of the example of a place like Sears, right? So Sears, the old department store that I think might still exist in the US, but certainly doesn't exist in Canada, right? So Sears went out of business. But on the way out, the CEO was paid a bonus. The workers lost their jobs. The CEO got a golden parachute for basically running the corporation into the ground. And this is, kind of the weird thing. Like he was making, I think at 60 times the average wage of the worker. And when the company ran into the ground, he had this exit thing so that in bankruptcy, he got to claim a bunch of the assets and walked away with his money. And the workers got nothing. And in a lot of cases, the workers lost their pensions. So, fun times. Okay, I can probably do one or two more slides. Actually, let's start here. Let's not push it. I know you probably all have to bolt back to the other side of the campus. And I try to remember that. My office is upstairs, so I can be back there in 2 minutes. I forget where you are. So let's stop here. I'll pick it up in post-industrialism on Wednesday. We're almost done concepts and theories, kind of. Well, we're getting there. We have a little bit left. I ambitiously thought I'd be done today, but I'm a fool. So we'll see you on Wednesday. We'll keep going with this, and we'll get out of it this week for sure.